Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Barsanti. I'm the Edwin Wolfe II Director of the Library Company of Philadelphia, and I'm very pleased to welcome you again to tonight's Fireside Chat. Tonight, we are very lucky to have with us one of our former fellows, Matthew Roberts. Matthew was one of our Barra International Fellows, but he was also one of our COVID period fellows and had his fellowship at a time we were closed. So Matthew was a willing participant in our remote fellowship program. So while he was using library company collections, and we'll talk about those in a few moments, he did so from, I would imagine, from his home in Sheffield, England. These programs, as you know, are what we hope to do. These programs is to share with you some of the work that our scholars do at the Library Company, and some of the research that's some of the work that's inspired by that research. Matthew is a great example of that. I'm looking forward to his talk. So Matthew is an associate professor of modern British history at Sheffield Hallam University in Sheffield, England. His works are mainly about political culture in Britain and the British Atlantic world in the age of revolution. His latest book, Chartism, Commemoration and the Cult of the Radical Hero, was published by Routledge in 2020. His next book, about which he'll be speaking tonight, Democratic Passions, The Politics of Feeling in British Popular Radicalism from 1809 to 1848, will be published by Manchester University Press in May of 2022. Matthew, I'm going to hand it over to you in a moment, but let me just say, first of all, for those of you attendance tonight, this is being presented as a webinar, and all that means is that when we get to the question and answer part of the evening, and I'm glad Matthew has agreed to answer some questions at the end of his presentation, please use the Q&A function that's down here somewhere at the bottom of your screen. We will be monitoring the chat as well, but Q&A works best when you use the Zoom function for it down there. I'll be moderating the questions. And that's about it. I guess don't raise your hand. We can't see you in this format, in the webinar format. So please use the Q&A or the chat. Anyway, without any further ado, let me hand it over to Matthew. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael, for that introduction. Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks for coming along, especially on a Friday night. It's not quite as late for you guys as it is for me here. It's 10:30 at night here, but I'm a night owl, so I'm more than happy to be speaking to you this evening. What I'm going to talk to you about this evening is the work. I'm just wondering if I can share my screen in this format. Doesn't seem to be doing it now. There we go. Yeah. I'm going to talk to you about work that I did whilst I was a remote fellow, as Michael mentioned, working at HSP, the Library Company. And in particular, the character at the center of my talk this evening and my research in Philadelphia is William Cobbett. And I'm going to begin a little bit later than the period that I'm going to mostly be talking about this evening. You'll see from my title slides here that I'm mainly going to be talking about the 1790s, but I'm going to fast forward to January 1820 for the moment. In late January of 1820, the English popular journalist William Cobbett, alias Peter Porcupine, and we'll come to his name later, wrote to his son, who was then resident on Long Island, New York. Recently returned to his native England from a period of political exile in the United States, William Cobbett, who you can see pictured here, complained that a combination of, quote, meanness, jealousy, spite, and fear, end quote, had conspired against his plans to hold a public dinner in memory of the foremost English itinerant revolutionary of the previous generation, Thomas Paine. finding the doors of London's inns and taverns closed to him. This was the latest in a series of rebuffs that Cobbett had faced since he'd returned to Britain some 3 months earlier, carrying in his luggage the bones of Thomas Paine. Cobbett relayed to his son how the recent state clampdown on radicalism had created an inhospitable political climate in which to realize his ambitions of giving Paine the funeral and monument to his memory that he had failed to receive at the hands of his adopted countrymen in the United States. This clampdown had led, in Cobbett's words, to feelings of alarm, which had, quote, interfered to prevent the triumph of reason. Now, despite all the excuses that he cited as to why his macabre actions of disinterring Paine's bones had failed to bring about the rebirth of radicalism, Cobbett, like other radicals on both sides of the Atlantic, wondered why, by the 1820s, the name of Thomas Paine was still so feared. These transatlantic exchanges are illustrative of the links that were being forged between like-minded radicals in the Anglophone Atlantic world, and indeed other forms of movements in the Atlantic world, in the age of reason and revolution. Cobbett's words are also revealing for two further reasons. First, they signifies the loyalists, or the anti-Jacobins, as they were termed, in the frenetic period of Paine's activism in the 1790s. And I'm happy to elaborate further in the questions on what I mean by loyalist and loyalism, terms I'll be using quite a lot this evening. Because it was not just revolutionaries and radicals like Paine and Cobbett, as he then was in the 1820s, who were part of a hemispheric community based on the circulation of people and ideas. There was also a loyalist Atlantic, made up of British conservatives and Tories, American Federalists, and other like-minded counter-revolutionaries, of which Cobbett was one of them in the 1790s. Anti-Jacobinism in 1790s North America was no exception to these kinds of links that we see around the Atlantic world. As a muckraking journalist, publisher, and bookseller in 1790s Philadelphia, Cobbett had done more than most to fashion a transatlantic anti-Jacobinism. Only in the first decade of the 19th century did he make the unusual transition from Tory to radical, from counter-revolutionary to revolutionary. So, in wondering why the name of Paine was still so feared, Cobbett was in danger of rewriting history by playing down the enduring intensity of anti-Jacobin feeling, which he and others had done so much to kindle in the 1790s. Now, this is probably one of the central themes of my paper this evening. Cobbett is still widely viewed as one of the most patriotic Englishmen of his age. Describing himself as a calf of John Bull, it's easy to see why many of his contemporaries, and subsequently some historians, have seen him as the quintessential true-born Englishman. But I think appearances can be deceiving. His was a complex, hybrid, and in some respects, utterly un-English personality. By the time he embarked on his famous rural rides around England in the 1820s, for which he's most famous for in Britain these days, Cobbett had actually spent nearly half of his adult life in North America. He was fluent in French, self-taught during the 6 months that he and his wife lived at St. Omer in 1792, and he was shaped just as much by his experiences on the eastern seaboard of North America as he was by his native rural England. Firstly, as a soldier stationed in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick between 1784 and 1791, then as a prolific and acerbic pamphleteer and journalist in Philadelphia in the 1790s, and latterly, very briefly, in New York, and finally, the period that I began my letter from him to his son, really, as a political exile in New York on Long Island between 1817 and 19. So, in other words, he spends quite a lot of time on the other side of the pond. Cobbett's biographers, of which there have been many, have struggled to label his politics, especially in the 1790s. A radical turned Tory, an English Tory in America, a Federalist, anti-Jacobin, anti-Democrat. Each of these labels have been used, but none of them fully capture the essence of his politics. Labeling Cobbett a Tory, for example, has the effect of erasing the American aspects, I would argue, and overemphasizing the British dimensions of his politics, and vice versa, federalism. It makes more sense, I want to suggest, to identify Cobbett as a loyalist, and for two linked reasons. First, he aggressively proclaimed his own loyalty to Britain in the 1780s and 1790s, though in his case it was always broader and more contested than simply loyalty to crown and empire. Just as his later radicalism would prove complex, so too was his loyalism. Second reason for labelling Cobbett a loyalist, when he was posted to the Canadian Maritimes in the 1780s, several encounters inducted him into loyalist networks, something that would survive his time in Wilmington and Philadelphia as well, which I'll return to later. But let me return to Cobbett's letter to his son and the second point of significance, and really the subject matter for my talk this evening, and that is emotion or feeling. The importance of feeling in loyalism has been widely alluded to by scholars, but only recently has it begun to receive serious attention. Drawing on the flourishing field of the history of emotions can help sketch out what I call the effective politics of the loyalist response to the age of revolution. Cobbett was part of a transatlantic network of loyalists and then radicals who were, amongst other things, debating the nature, place, and significance of the passions, the term used to denote feeling during this period, as part of their engagement with the legacy of the Enlightenment, the American Revolution, and, most centrally, their response to the French Revolution. To fully make sense of Cobbett, we need to situate him in the context of transatlantic loyalist communities in North America and bring together the separate historiographies of American, Canadian, and English loyalism. It was his encounters with the physical and emotional suffering of loyalists in the 1780s as a soldier stationed in British North America, and in 1792-3 as a team of French emigres in Wilmington, Delaware, that laid the effective groundworks of his virulent anti-Jacobinism in Philadelphia for the remainder of the 1790s. Although feelings of loss, separation, and trauma were central to loyalism, this cluster of negative feelings fails to capture the emotional experience of being a loyalist. Cheerfulness and resilience in the face of hardship and revolution also characterized the loyalist response, and Cobbett was no exception. Let me give you an example. When Cobbett was in the Canadian Maritimes in the 1780s, he found himself in very challenging circumstances. He was a new recruit. He had enlisted in the West Norfolk 54th Foot Regiment in 1784 in an unfamiliar and difficult environment, while at the same time continuing an arduous program of self-education. He was an autodidact. And yet, despite these challenges, his abiding memory of this episode was largely one of happiness, though this did not blind him to the suffering that he and other loyalists endured. The source of his happiness was spending time with a family of, quote, Yankee loyalists who had accepted grants of land in the King's province of New Brunswick. Following the relocation of his regiment to Fredericton, Cobbett was effectively on detached service, exploring the interior of the province along the St. John River. Having gotten lost on one of his expeditions, he stumbled across the home of loyalist refugees and was promptly adopted into the family and spent more than 2 years with them. A pretty happy time, I think it has to be said, an unusual time for someone who was meant to be on active military service, that he was basically welcomed into this family of loyalists who had fled the United States in the aftermath of the American Revolution. He was struck by their generous hospitality, the stoutness and hardiness of the two sons in the family, and the beauty of their daughter. And like other displaced loyalists, he clearly found solace in friendship and elective kinship, through which the shared misery of exile was both expressed and eased. The intense feelings of love that Cobbett harbored towards the daughter, I think, throws into relief some of the suffering that bedeviled the wider loyalist diaspora. It's worth remembering, as Maya Jasanoff pointed out a number of years ago, that some 60,000 loyalist refugees left the United States in the aftermath of the American Revolution. the War of Independence, with more than half of them coming to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Now, Cobbett was already betrothed to the daughter of an army sergeant he had met the year before in Nova Scotia, but his fiancée was now thousands of miles away back in England. And for what we know, for what he says about the episode, he remains very faithful and doesn't pursue the new love interest. But the language he used to describe his own anguish after deciding to remain faithful to his betrothed in the face of such captivating beauty, I think can be taken as proxy for the loyalist diasporic feelings of loss and separation. And here's a long quotation from Cobbett where he's talking about those feelings. Here was the present against the absent. Here was the power of the eyes pitted against memory. Here were all of the senses up in arms to subdue the influence of thoughts. Here was vanity. Here was passion. Here was the spot of all spots in the world. And here were also the life and the manners and the habits and the pursuits that I delighted in. Further akin to the displaced loyalist, Cobbett eventually felt the anguish of enforced separation, consequent on the removal eventually of his regiment, which severed him from his adopted Yankee family. To describe this parting, he said, would be too painful, even at this distant day, 1829, when he writes some autobiographical reminiscence later in his life. Notwithstanding this suffering, the dominant feeling expressed by Cobbett, though, was one of stoicism and even cheerfulness, of resilience in the face of hardship, lightened through friendship and kinship networks. This was a set of feelings that also comes across in some of the letters that have survived between members of the British North American loyalists, while those in the community who transgressed those feeling rules were reprimanded. So I think what we can conclude of this formative period in Cobbett's life is that his first impressions of American life were formed not so much through the eyes of American Tories, in the words of one of his biographers, but through sharing in the feelings of British American loyalists. If we fast forward to the late 1790s, Cobbett had become one of the foremost widely read pamphleteers and journalists in America, even conceded by his Democrat enemies. This was the period when Cobbett adopted the pseudonym of Peter Porcupine. And I'm happy to discuss in the questions why he might have chosen this name. Various kind of explanations, I think. None of them conclusive, it has to be said. His many interventions in the public sphere in the 1790s were widely remarked upon for their lack of restraint and their appeal to base passions by, amongst others, the journalist Franklin Bache. Yet beneath what often appeared as little more than artless invective and visceral feelings of fear and hatred in Cobbett's journalism was the beginnings of a carefully crafted and sophisticated effective politics that would endure for the rest of Cobbett's life. Although sentimentalism was an important part of anti-Jacobin feeling, it was not the only ingredient. Alongside it was a rival set of feeling rules, what I will term asceticism. In contrast to sentimentalism, which was a set of feeling rules which licensed the intense outpouring of feeling, asceticism emphasized restraint, rationality, and aversion to unbridled passion. Now, there was a tension in Cobbett's and the broader loyalist and anti-Jacobin community. There was a tension in their effective politics between sentimentalism and asceticism. But in Cobbett's case, it was a tension that would eventually be resolved in favor of the latter, asceticism. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So there's no doubt that much of what we know about Cobbett's life in the 1780s was written for the express purpose in the 1790s and beyond to demonstrate that he and those like him, Cobbett was a man of very humble birth. He'd been born the sons of agricultural laborers, and much of his life, in whatever political guise we happen to be looking at him, whether as a loyalist in the 1790s or as a radical later in Britain, I would see one of the central purposes of his politics is to demonstrate that those like him, the working classes, were men of refined feeling and therefore civilized and thus worthy of political citizenship. Cobbett felt the need to emphasize this because of his humble background as an agricultural laborer and then as a soldier, two lowly groups who were widely seen as brutish and unfeeling by elites on both sides of the Atlantic. In Cobbett's case, though, this did not lead to unchecked outpourings of sentiment. While he and other loyalists clearly found succor in friendship, love, shared patriotic feelings, the feeling rules of loyalism, we can term it that, were meant to be empowering and to equip its adherents with emotional resilience in the face of suffering and loss. A notable silence in Cobbett's autobiographical writings, which recount the 1780s and 90s, is any dwelling on the suffering, at least not of a debilitating kind, either of his own, beyond being lovesick and an occasional gripe about the landscape and weather in Canada, or on the part of the displaced loyalist community. This silence becomes even more remarkable during the early 1790s, when Cobbett set himself up as a teacher of English to French emigres fleeing France, and especially the French West Indies during the revolutionary upheavals in Haiti, Saint-Domingue, and in France. A set of letters from Cobbett to one of his students and for a time lodger, James Matthew, has survived from this period, which are part of the collection of Cobbett's papers held by the Historical Society of Pennsylvania that I was able to work on during my fellowship. And I want to devote my remaining time this evening to these letters. Matthew was a French merchant who had fled Saint-Domingue following the slave revolt in 1791. Cobbett was able to profit from the kinds of entangled Atlantic histories that historians have highlighted in recent years, in which the British, French, and Spanish empires, amongst others, intersected with one another. His brief period in France, where he'd learnt the French language, and his mastery of English grammar as part of his self-education in the army, the 1780s, both of these experiences furnished him with the necessary skills and opportunity to profit from the arrival of French refugees, significant numbers of whom were arriving at ports on the eastern seaboard of the United States. As early as 1790, 1 in 6 Philadelphians were French nationals. In Wilmington, Cobbett witnessed for himself the impact of the revolution on the French refugees, and because of his fluency in the French language, he was able to participate in the heated discussions taking place within the French refugee community about the revolutionary changes taking place in Paris, Europe, and the Caribbean, though unfortunately he did not elaborate on the substance of those discussions. To characterize Cobbett's politics as merely assimilating and articulating traditional Anglo-American loyalist argument runs the risk of obscuring, I think, these broader Atlantic entanglements. So Cobbett's second impression of American life and the Atlantic world was formed in part then through the eyes and feelings of French loyalist emigres, who, despite the different political and imperial contexts, also experienced displacement. The lurid accounts of the slave revolt perhaps hardened Cobbett's emerging racism, for which he would become infamous for, even during his radical period in Britain. While feelings of loss, loneliness, painful grief, and homesickness were all part of the French and indeed wider loyalist diaspora, once again, the feeling rules of loyalism were ultimately geared towards resilience. The physical and emotional hardships of exile were made easier by networks of friends, family, and business forged in pre-revolutionary times. Cobbett was clearly aware of the precarity of his situation, heavily tied as it was to that of the French refugees. His plan, as late as July 1794, was to relocate to the Caribbean for no longer than 3 years before returning to Britain. Quote, "The greatest part of my acquaintance in this country, in the United States, are French merchants from San Domingo and Martinico. To one of those islands, I shall probably go in about 8 or 9 months," he said. Just a bit of context for you. You might be wondering, why is Cobbett an Englishman in America at all by the 1790s? His time in the army in Canada had not ended well. He'd come back to Britain full of stories of the corruption of army officers in the Maritimes, and he tried to pursue this, but in the end, the army and both the government closed ranks, and he publishes a very kind of incendiary account of the corruption he's experienced in the army. And had he remained in Britain, he'd almost certainly and would have been court-martialed or sent to prison on trumped up charges of sedition. So that's why he flees England and goes to France briefly, then gets caught up in the early stages of the French Revolution, and decides he doesn't want to be part of that. So leaves France for the United States and arrives at Wilmington, where he starts to make these friendships with French refugees. His knowledge of the Caribbean was clearly formed through his contact with French emigres. In 1796, in Philadelphia, he published his own translation of the French emigre Moreau de Saint-Méry's topographical and political description of the Spanish part of San Domingo. Presumably, the escalating hostilities and instability in the region, the Caribbean, decided him to remain in the United States. It was also anxieties that Cobbett had about the potential transient nature of the French presence in Wilmington that prompted his move to Philadelphia. As he explained to Mathieu, if the French left, his business as a tutor of English would collapse, whereas, quote, at Philadelphia, there will always be resources for me, either as a maître de langue or otherwise. Well, what about these letters then between Cobbett and Mathieu? On the surface, they are unremarkable as far as any clues as to Cobbett's politics. They are dominated very much by the mundane and the personal, and I think that's probably why his many biographers have largely skated over this set of letters. But the tone of the correspondence is sociable, solicitous, and affectionate, and dominated by the language of sentiment and domestic retirement, according to one recent account, one of the few that has paid attention to these letters. But I think the letters can also be read as written testimony of Cobbett seeking to reactivate the kinds of loyalist networks and attendant feelings that he had been part of in British North America in the decade before. Arriving in a new country, again, with no connections or friends, he clearly invested emotionally as well as financially in his new venture as an English teacher. Quote, I have this moment received your kind letter, and it has filled my house with joy, Cobbett told Mathieu in January 1793. 6 months later, quote, I am proud that you call me your best friend. I wish I had it in my power to render you half the service my heart would dictate. And 4 months after that, quote, in you I had an agreeable companion, a friend and a brother. Our humours were alike. For the most part, the letters are characterized by, again, cheerfulness and resilience in the face of the daily challenges thrown up by living in a new and alien environment, as well as the day-to-day travails experienced by any young family at this time. Cobbett is the father of a growing family of very small children. Although the letters from Mathieu do not survive, we have Cobbett's responses. Judging by Cobbett's replies, neither appear to have dwelt at any length on the loyalist themes of loss and separation. On the contrary, Cobbett's letters are characterized by an ebullient boosterism, which extended to the emotional realm. Both men clearly believed that they had it in their power to change how they felt by altering their circumstances from misery to happiness. In one letter, we learn that Cobbett is taking in French lodgers as an additional way of making money to supplement his tutoring. Unsure about whether he liked a new female lodger, he told Mathieu that he would have no scruples about evicting her if it soon transpired that he disliked her, for, quote, I am determined not to live with people I do not like. More significantly, we see in the advice he gave to Mathieu the beginnings of the ascetic feeling rules, which would characterize his later effective politics. Now, I'm conscious that asceticism has connotations of austerity, self-denial, stoicism, in short, a mental state free of feeling in the face of suffering. This is not to imply that ascetic feeling rules prescribed all appeals to feeling, or that its adherents were themselves some kind of unfeeling automata, only that their stated aversion to appeals to the passions, particularly the bad passions and miserable and debilitating kind of emotions, was an important part of their feeling rules. In short, the purpose was not to purge passion, but master it and integrate it into one's private and public life. And indeed, the two were seen as linked. Ascetic feeling rules were also about expressing the right feelings in the right place at the right time. And drawing attention to episodes when this failed to happen was part of asceticism's armory in its many battles with enemies deemed callous or prone to excess of feeling. So some examples from the letters. For all the friendliness that Cobbett exudes in his letters, this did not preclude him from adopting a slightly headmasterly tone in his injunctions to Matthew, not just to persevere in his study and practice of the English language, but also to adhere to a code of feeling rules that Cobbett believed necessary for contentment. Quote, "Be sure, my dear friend, that you are much too happy," he wrote to Matthew in November 1793. Exhibitions of excessive happiness, he warned, provoked envy in those around the light-hearted. Quote, "Envy is the damnation of mankind. No happy man escapes it, and therefore I pray you to guard against its envenomed tooth. An open and generous heart, such as Matthew's," Cobbett cautioned, "was not calculated to guard against such machinations." Sailing close to Bathos, he then abruptly altered the mood and reassured Matthew that he did not wish him, quote, "to live in continual fear, only to exercise prudence and caution." From the remainder of the letter, it's not entirely clear what the object of the discussion was, whether matters of the heart, business, or learning, each of which were to varying degrees obliquely referenced. But what is clear, and indeed a number of other similar exchanges, were letters between two friends who found themselves taking comfort in one another in new, strange, and in some respects dangerous environments. Yellow fever was then raging, and financial ruin was always just around the corner. And in the process, outlining a set of protective feeling rules relating to public and private life is part of their armory. In the next and most public stages in Cobbett's career in North America, he would attempt to put into practice these feeling rules as a pamphleteer and journalist in Philadelphia, even if his occasional sentimentalism did not accord with the asceticism that he preached. And just to conclude the sort of last bit of his time in America, which I don't really have time to go into detail about his time as a journalist in Philadelphia this evening, but he left Delaware in February 1794 and moved to 81 Callowhill Street in Philadelphia, where he remained until 1796 before moving to North 2nd Street, opposite Christchurch, where he set up shop as a printer, publisher, and bookseller. While his residence there has attracted some attention from his many biographers, I think there's still a tendency to write off this period as a brief Tory interlude in an otherwise radical career, not least because he emerged as a vociferous defender of Britain, a supporter of the Federalists, and a Tory opponent of democracy. Focusing on his effective politics, I think, allows us to see much more clearly the shifts as well as the continuities in his political career. Cobbett died in 1835 and remained very politically active until the end, becoming an MP eventually in Britain. So while his political views might be exchanged from radical to Tory, fidelity to one's feelings was sacrosanct. As Cobbett's career progressed, he increasingly defended Old England, by which he meant a way of life rooted in a series of mutually reinforcing affections to one's family, community, and nation. Conversely, he openly and vehemently denounced those who posed a threat to these affections. The place, nature, and significance of feeling was central to the polarization of American politics in the 1790s, as politicians and the people debated what form liberty and democracy should take. Emphasizing the transatlantic framing of these debates deepens historical understanding of Cobbett, loyalism, and anti-Jacobinism as products of an entangled Atlantic world. Cobbett's shop served as a conduit for anti-Jacobin literature that was being produced in Britain and France, notably by Burke and Abbé Borel. This was a literature that emphasized feeling, the effective ties of kin, friendship, love of country, over the subversive, rootless, and cold-hearted reason that allegedly underpinned cosmopolitanism, the French revolutionaries, the Jacobins in particular. Building on the effective politics of loyalism that he'd encountered in British North America, Cobbett's anti-Jacobinism unsurprisingly accented the corrosive effect of the French revolutionaries on the effective ties of family, friendship, and community, a triangulated set of effective coordinates that underpinned loyalist cheerfulness. Tellingly, Cobbett summarized his career as a Philadelphian journalist in the following terms, quote, "I have endeavored to make America laugh instead of weep. Let me conclude. A case study of Cobbett and transatlantic loyalism illustrates the potential of the history of emotions to enrich understandings of transatlantic political culture, in particular by bringing into focus a tension within histories of the public sphere between reason and feeling. Jürgen Habermas's argument that the 18th century witnessed the rise of a rational public sphere characterized by emotional restraint and reason has cast a long shadow over the historiography of the Enlightenment and the Age of Revolution and Reason. And yet the Age of Reason was also an age of sentimentalism, a tension that Cobbett himself embodied. For those like Cobbett, the pursuit of a politics of pure reason, of a public sphere of cool, rational debate, was neither possible nor desirable, but a dangerous and subversive chimera which facilitated the unleashing of base passion. For Cobbett and the wider loyalist community, those who justified their actions in the name of reason were guilty of a more fundamental defect. That was the failure to display appropriate feeling. A charge that was sufficiently capacious to deride their enemies as either unfeeling brutes or, somewhat paradoxically, creatures of excessive feeling. Historians of emotion have rightly begun to show how reason and feeling were intertwined in the 18th century public sphere. But I think we need to go further than this, not least because many contemporaries did, highlighting the effective qualities of political reason by showing how reason itself was based on a particular understanding and combination of feeling, allows us to transcend the enduring and unhelpful reason-feeling dyad. The late 18th century, more so perhaps than any other time, has presented historians with a paradox. On the one hand, an age of reason predicated on the assumption of a rational public sphere in which passions had no place or ought to have no place. On the other hand, an age of sentiment or sentimentalism, of intense public displays of feeling. But this contradiction dissolves somewhat once we realize that reason, no less than its putative opposite, feeling, was itself an effective construct. And here we need to return to the false dichotomy that Cobbett himself posited in 1820 when he claimed that feeling had conspired against reason to prevent the commemoration of pain. As the claims and counterclaims of radicals, loyalists, revolutionaries, and counter-revolutionaries, and of Cobbett and his enemies suggests, there was no such thing as a politics of pure reason, unsullied by feeling. Claims to political rationality were not only paved with effective tensions, but reason itself was also an effective construct. Granted, there were differences and divisions over the place, nature, and significance of feeling, but all claims to rationality were and are based on a particular set of feelings. Being rational in the age of reason meant learning how to feel in a particular way. Those who failed to do this were deemed callous, cold, unfeeling, and brutish. Thanks to those like Cobbett, the loyalist Atlantic was predicated not just on the movement of people, goods, and ideas, but also feeling. Thank you very much. Ooh.
Thank you. Sorry, I was muted. I wanted to, again, just thank Matthew for the talk. Also to encourage any of you who have questions to use the Q&A function below, and we'll pass them along. As people are thinking of questions, I wanted to follow up on one thing that you, one thing you suggested in your talk, Matthew, which is you might tell us a little bit more about the porcupine.
Yeah.
And why Cobbett chose the porcupine.
Yeah, great question. So I was able to find out a little bit more about that during my remote fellowship. Let me just find where I've got further details on it. Yeah, so publishing under the pseudonym of Peter Porcupine. Cobbett says that he originally adopted a name to disguise his English origins. He didn't want people to know in Philadelphia that he was English. He thought that that would somehow invalidate the contributions that he was making, believing that it would unduly prejudice American readers against him. So he authors a series of pamphlets that established him as the kind of anti-Jacobin writer. But why exactly he chose this pseudonym is unclear. One of his biographers suggested that one of his enemies called him a porcupine, and that Cobbett adopted it as a nom de guerre. And I did have the slide, actually. I'll just share my screen again. It's a very famous caricature that is, you can see a copy of it in, I think, either the library company or, yeah, there it is. Yeah, a porcupine. It did not escape his enemies at this time that porcupines were rodents with sharp spindles capable of injuring any assailant. And it may also not be a coincidence, this is the thing I found while I was doing my fellowship, that one of the British sloops of war traversing the Atlantic at this time was called the Porcupine. And I wonder if that's really where Cobbett kind of got the idea from. Operated out of Portsmouth in the south of England, the place where Cobbett actually had first sighted the mighty English Navy as a young boy, which had instilled in him this desire to enlist and travel the world. But yeah, I mean, it's something that he delights in publishing invective. And any of you know anything about Cobbett's contributions to the public sphere in Philadelphia in the 1790s will know that his contributions are seen as lacking in decorum. They're incredibly personal. He doesn't pull his punches. There's an intense feeling to them. And I think one of the things that I was conscious of is that beneath what looks like artless invective in Cobbett's case is actually a very carefully crafted set of feeling rules, for want of a better phrase. And that whilst on the surface it might look like this is someone shooting from the hip, he's attacking all of these Democrats in American politics and for their pro-French sympathies, etc., and their hostilities towards his native country of Britain. If you look at the kinds of criticisms he makes of these people, it is always that they are either unfeeling or they fail to display the appropriate feeling in the appropriate context. So these long pamphlets he writes where he attacks the French revolutionaries, the Jacobins in particular, one of the things that horrifies him is that he claims to have received reports that the Jacobins were punishing people for displaying feeling. So when children saw their parents executed, they were not allowed to cry. And Cobbett thinks this is an absolute travesty of human nature, that you've got a political regime in power that is preventing people from expressing the kinds of emotions that to him seem deeply rational, for want of a better phrase. Sorry, that kind of takes us quite far from his name as Porcupine, but it's relevant in the sense that only on the surface does he look like someone who's literally just, writing away. And I think beneath that is a very carefully crafted politics.
Another question came in on the chat, which comes from Michelle Flamer. How were his racist views manifested?
Very good question. I think it is always important to acknowledge Cobbett's racism. It's not been something, I think, until quite recently in this country that has been given the due that it merits. It's always been kind of like, ooh, this guy is on the right side of history in so many of his views, campaigning for democratic rights. And it's just too easy, I think, to kind of go, oh, and by the way, he was a virulent negrophobe in the language of the time. But even by contemporary standards, I think Cobbett's racism is extreme. And I think, but I haven't found it's suggestive rather than conclusive, that I wonder whether his first introduction to racism and negrophobia, as it was called at the time, was picked up from the loyalist community in the Canadian Maritimes. Obviously, it's not just white people that leave America in droves after the American Revolution, but there's also a significant black presence in Nova Scotia and to a lesser extent New Brunswick, I think. And I wonder whether he picks up on some of the racism there that some members of the white loyalist community and indeed others in that society demonstrate. But I haven't found conclusive evidence for that. And then secondly, I wonder also whether he picks up some of this from French refugees fleeing Saint-Domingue in the 1790s, who are, of course, are coming to Philadelphia and Wilmington with awful tales about what the blacks are up to in Saint-Domingue. So basically, by the time he arrives back in Britain and becomes a radical in the first decade of the 19th century, I think the beginnings of his racism are already well in place. But the final ingredient to it, of which there is a lot of evidence for, like a lot of English radicals, he finds what Charles Dickens would later call telescopic philanthropy really repellent. So he's saying that you've got all people like Wilberforce, who he hates, who are concerned about the plight of slaves thousands of miles away, whilst they're ignorant of the white slavery, as Cobbett calls it, of the English working class, who are victims of oppression worse than slavery, is what he says. Very kind of controversial, incendiary claim both then and now. And he's not unusual in that respect. There's quite a few English radicals who, again, are on the right side of history, if you like, in many respects, but not when it comes to their attitude towards race and slavery.
Thank you. A question from Joseph Rosenblum. Yes, does Cobbett discuss Lawrence Sterne, Mackenzie, or other sentimental authors of the period?
Not that I'm aware of, no. Cobbett's great love is Jonathan Swift. And when he runs away from home as a sort of teenager on several occasions. He's kind of brought up and raised in southern England, and he flees to London, and he forgoes the few pennies in his pocket for food and buys a copy of Jonathan Swift's Tale of a Tub, and it absolutely captivates him. Partly, he says, because I didn't really understand what it was about, but he likes, I think, the Augustan satire. He likes the kind of barbs, the invective. That's probably where some of this comes from. And then one of the most painful experiences where he is at his most sentimental is he talks about how he lost that copy of the Tale of the Tub over the side of the boat when he arrived in the Canadian Maritimes. And he said it's one of the most painful things he's ever experienced in his entire life, losing this book that had been his intellectual awakening, basically. That he'd read under a haystack in London, and instead of buying bread and cheese, had bought this book from a shop, and then fell asleep when it was too dark to kind of read anymore, and then woke up and kind of made his way back home eventually, but of a very different person, I think. But no, I'm not. Cobbett, he's also one of those people who claims to be an original thinker, and a bit like Thomas Paine, and they don't always cite their sources as a way of, exaggerating their originality. But in many respects, I think Cobbett is quite well read, but he pretends that he's not as well read as he is.
Thank you. A question from Elizabeth Yang. She writes that she appreciates that Cobbett himself was an embodiment of both reason and sentiment, but wonders if religious faith played a role in Cobbett's life and understanding of the relation between reason and passions. Yeah,
really interesting. That's a great question. Cobbett is nominally an Anglican, in the sense that anybody kind of born at this time, unless they've got dissenting parents and traditions or are Roman Catholic, are Church of England, and he claims to die a supporter of the Church of England. But Cobbett spent most of the 1820s and the remainder of his life in the 1830s campaigning very strongly for Catholic emancipation in the United Kingdom. And G.K. Chesterton, who of course was a convert to Catholicism himself, claims that Cobbett died a closet Catholic. And I think where this is relevant, what we're talking about this evening, is that because of his transatlantic connections, because of his friendships with some Irish radicals and loyalists who find themselves also in America, he starts to find out much more about Catholicism, which he acknowledges. He said, look, we've been brought up a Protestant, and in Britain, we've been brought up to kind of think that Catholics are evil. They've got, 15 toes and 20 fingers, and they're absolutely awful. And then he slowly realizes that the kind of politics that he wants to see restored on both sides of the Atlantic is really a form of social Catholicism. He talks a lot about the sacking of the monasteries, and he thinks the whole Reformation was a fraud perpetrated against the people by Henry VIII and his acolytes. And it strips away a level of kind of communal support that had existed in Britain. I mean, in some respects, it's a very romanticized view of Merry England, where monasteries, he said, served as kind of job centers for the unemployment, as hospitals, and he wants to see a restoration of that. Now, a lot of historians have said, oh, but there's nothing theological in this. This is just Cobbett saying, let's have a kind of social Catholicism. But what he likes about Catholicism is the emphasis that it places not just on faith alone, but also faith and works. And he says the main thing wrong with Protestantism is that it just focuses on faith, so that you can live your life as a miser and hate the poor, but as long as you've got faith in Jesus, you'll be assured of an ever after life. And he thinks that's a travesty. And that's why he likes Catholicism, because you've got to have both faith and works. And he picks up some of this from Matthew Carey, another journalist in Philadelphia in the 1790s. Of course, in that guise, Cobbett and Carey had been enemies. Carey's obviously a radical Democrat, but when Cobbett finds himself back on Long Island in 1817, by which time he's a radical, there's a series of exchanges between Cobbett and Carey where they both basically apologize for the invective they unleashed against one another in the 1790s. And Cobbett claims that is the moment when he starts to see Catholicism in a very different way. So yet again, it's a transatlantic exchange in a way that begins Cobbett's journey towards campaigning for rights for Catholics back in Britain.
Matthew, one of the things that's so interesting about the story that you have told tonight and the Cobbett story is that so much of it is about these kinds of like changing sides and boundary crossing and fluidity between, does he support the United States? A Federalist, he's a Tory, he's a Protestant, he's a Catholic, and I think, I'm wondering, like, as someone who hasn't completely hasn't done all the reading around this idea of like the politics of feeling and this idea of feeling versus reason, is that does that help us to sort things here? Like, I guess we're so used to thinking in this dyadic way of like, well, if you believe feeling is more important than reason, then you're more likely to be this, and you're more like to try to place things on their sides. But it sounds like the story that you're telling about Cobbett is actually about the way in which this allows him to kind of go back and forth between different regimes.
The only thing that is a constant in Cobbett's life is basically says on several occasions in different ways, you must be true to your feeling. And if that means you change your opinions, you change your convictions, you change your politics, then that's fine. But what must remain a constant is you must be true. You must use feeling as a guide, because if we don't, that is a very dangerous place to be, because of what he sees being done in the name of reason in both the United States and much more so in France. For him, it's that's it. I don't know. I'm thinking of Rousseau and conscience as well, rather than obviously when Rousseau starts to kind of reject the Enlightenment and becomes the father figure of Romanticism. I think there's a parallel with Cobbett there as well, that like a number of people who are critically thinking in the late 18th century, reason ain't all what it's cracked up to be, and it leads to some kind of dangerous, barren places.
Yeah. Is there, you know, in 21st century, we would look at this distinction between reason and feeling as being highly gendered, right? Is there a gender component to this in the 18th and 19th century? Is there a way in which this emphasis on feeling is gendered female, or is that just not?
Yeah, Cobbett has one of the interventions he makes in Philadelphia in the 1790s is to attack the role of women in politics. I forget who exactly it was, but somebody had made an intervention in the public sphere through a pamphlet, and Cobbett basically says, politics is not for women, because I don't, if I remember rightly, it's not the conventional sort of argument that politics is the domain of reason and women are creatures of passion, therefore there's no place for them in politics. It's almost the kind of argument that politics is too bound up with feeling and potentially anger and violence, that therefore it's an unsuitable domain for women, which of course is just as exclusionary. But it is, as always with Cobbett, he has a idiosyncratic take on things. Right. But yeah, certainly going forward and thinking more of the British case, there is a very strong assumption that women are creatures of passion, and therefore we need to limit political citizenship to rational males. I mean, that is an argument that I think a lot of radicals also share with the political elites of the time back in Britain as well. I mean, not all of them, but certainly a lot of them. And Cobbett, in a roundabout sort of way, would be somebody who would, I think, say, yeah, politics is not the domain for women to be involved in.
Right. Well, we have come to the end of our time. I'm conscious it is already tomorrow, I think, where you are, Matthew.
Yeah.
Your weekend is now, we're well into your weekend.
Yeah.
But it's a wonderful start to our weekend. Thank you so much for a really great presentation and a really fascinating paper. I hope we finally get to see you in Philadelphia sometime.
I hope so too. That would be great.
And we will look forward to your book coming out in May.
Thank you very much. And it's been a pleasure to share some of my research with you. And thanks for the questions as well. I appreciate that very much.
Very good. Well, again, thank you. And thank you all for coming tonight, and hope everyone has a great weekend. Good night. Join us again on February 3rd. We'll have our first African American History Month program. You can follow all of this best in our social media, on our Facebook page, where you'll also, if you look at our Instagram feed, you'll get a great picture of the porcupine. And we will hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thanks.